5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have liftoff.
Welcome to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Allison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. Co-pilot Pearson and I are on our summer break, but to help keep you sane, dear citizens of Planet Normal, while we're away, we're bringing you some of our biggest interviews from our recent archive, the discussions we've had on Planet Normal, the rocket of right thinking, the flying refuge of reasoned views. Now, back in January, just after the realities of the Post Office scandal had come to the fore, courtesy of a hard-hitting ITV drama, the true scale of the injustice was laid bare for all to see. Allison spoke to an anonymous insider from Fujitsu, the Japanese company that designed and managed the Horizon online accounting system that had caused so many problems for Post Office Sub-Postmasters trying to balance their books. Over 900 sub-postmasters were wrongly prosecuted for stealing because of incorrect information from Horizon, with many sent to prison for false accounting and theft, resulting in financial ruin. In mid-January, Planet Normal featured an interview with Robin, not their real name, who worked at Fujitsu in the mid-2000s and described Horizon as, quotes, obsolete only a few years after its rollout. Allison started by asking Robin whether the ITV drama of the Post Office scandal was an accurate representation of the system's failures.
So fundamentally, seeing that on TV really brought me back into what I understood how the counter behaved. And it was basically vulnerable to a loss in connection, and it was also vulnerable to software failures. The terminal could crash and you get a blue screen. And seeing that happen, we were aware that the terminal software itself also was not as robust, I think was the word that was used later in the documentary, which had me then at that point thinking, hang on a second, what I know at the time to what I then heard subsequently years later, they didn't add up.
So what you said to me before was that with the modem, listeners will remember the beep beep of the modem connection. If the connection was lost, the transaction could have been made, and then when the connection was re-established, the transaction or payment could be duplicated and taken again. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly something that they considered a lot. Going back 20 years, I mean, this predates broadband. And you've got rural post offices that have got little more than a phone line. But there are rural parts of the country that still haven't really got viable broadband. So 20 years ago, the situation was you would use a modem, you'd dial up, you get that clicking noise. And the counters were designed for this eventuality in that they would hold the transactions in the event of no connection to the main service. And they were meant then to catch up, if you like, and upload their transactions. The terminals themselves were basically PCs, computers of their time. So they didn't have the huge amounts of storage that you take for granted today, and they had a very limited capability. I think from memory it was 35 days worth. And then that was split into trading periods. And the idea then is that you had to upload the data from that day, or absolute worst case, if a phone line had gone wrong and needed repairing, you had to upload data within a certain number of days. And that process was designed in such a way that nothing would be lost. But we worked with some of the people that were working on the new counter, and they were telling us, well, that's just not the case. They were quite eager to tell us that there were, more modern solutions to this. It was an obsolete platform, I think, even when it was implemented. A lot of the people we were working with didn't really have many nice things to say about the counter.
Now, can I just make it clear? What you're calling the counter is the terminal or screen that people will have seen in the drama. The second explanation you offered to me about why Joe and the other postmasters might have been seeing these big shortfalls is that Fujitsu staff could intervene and log into the sub-postmasters' terminals, try to rectify errors and make them worse.
Yeah, I mean, that was something that we were not aware of. It was something around the time 2004, 2005. Fujitsu were being asked to look at replacing the old platform. And I was part of this big group of people that were trying to work that out. And I think we didn't actually know that that could be done. And yet, one of the things to kind of bear in mind when you look to replace something this massive is there's a word that we use called the end user, okay? And it's not just the sub-postmasters and the people in the Crown offices that are the end users. You've actually got other end users. So you've got service and support staff. You're going to have post office employees that are going to want to look at the performance of their business, performance of post offices. So there's a lot of end users that actually need to run and operate the system as well.
But it was categorically stated by the Post Office, specifically by Paul Reynolds, that nobody was accessing the private systems of the postmasters. And that wasn't true, was it?
Well, no, it wasn't true. And I think listening to Paul Reynolds in that parliamentary committee saying nobody has access, that doesn't chime with how you build an operational mission critical system, because you have to have people that can go in and do things to keep it running.
You mentioned one sub-postmaster we saw in the ITV drama, Lee Castleton. What do you think happened in Lee's branch in Bridlington?
I mean, the thing that got me, and this was what piqued my interest, and I was watching along, and he said, well, he had a till roll in front of him, and he was on the phone to the help desk, and he said, this can't be me because it's a different terminal. And I just literally, my mouth was open. I actually pressed pause on it, and I said, that doesn't make any sense. If that wasn't him, then who was it?
Yeah. So just to be clear, Lee Castleton had 2 what you call counters or terminals in his branch.
I mean, that was the conclusion I drew.
So Fujitsu staff could have been tapping into the second terminal that Lee Castleton wasn't using.
And this is what fired my interest. This is when I thought, you know what, tomorrow I'm going to go and start looking at the inquiry website, and I'm going to go through my recollections being 20 years old. It was no more than intuition or gut feel. This isn't right.
Their lawyer, the Post Office lawyer, said, and I quote, the Post Office wanted to make an example of Lee Castleton to prove that Horizon was robust. Lee was bankrupted by having to pick up the $320,000 costs of the legal case the Post Office brought against him. Were there ever any grounds for claiming that Horizon was robust? Yes or no? Tell me.
No, there's no grounds. I can tell you categorically why. So I started to look into the evidence that had been pulled together for the inquiry, and there is a particular document. But basically what that document does is it states the different lines of support. Now, these are the end users I was referring to earlier. You typically have 4 lines. That's standard. There are international standards on this kind of thing called ITIL. And so I thought, right, okay, they've got 4 lines of support. Well, so far, so good. And you go down the first line, the second line, you get to the third line in this document, and it basically says that the third line support at Fujitsu has unlimited access to the system and the ability to change data.
Can I ask you what the date of that document was? 2002. Right, so very early on.
Very, very early on. So, I mean, it was a system conceived, I think, in 1999. And it was completed, I think, in 2002. And I looked at that document, and I've gone on to work for other companies that provide mission-critical systems and run mission-critical systems. And I saw that section of the third-line support where they're able to change any data, and they are concerned that they can do it without any sufficient audit trail. And they can do that in a way where they say there's the potential for these people to commit acts of fraud. Then I started to realize, right, okay, if you can change data in a way that is undetectable, and I was so alarmed at this point, I then started to dig in, and Richard Roll's evidence, not just to the Panorama documentary from 2015, but then into the actual inquiry itself, I listened very intently, and he categorically said that they could go in and change postmaster data and make it look as if the postmaster had done it.
Robin, you joined Fujitsu in 2004 from a very state-of-the-art R&D job. What was your first impression of the setup at Fujitsu in terms of how up-to-date the Horizon system was?
In terms of my In terms of my first impressions of Fujitsu, my first day there, and I sort of said, okay, so how does the place work? And I was absolutely struck by, it was an obsolete setup. It was arcane. It was almost Victorian in terms of its approaches. Everything was written down into 100-page documents, and people are busy. They don't have time to read a 100-page document. If you want to know how something works, you would say, I'll just go and get that document for you. And it would arrive, and it'd be 250 pages long, written in words with very few pictures.
So what you're saying is that it was extremely slow-moving.
Slow-moving, very.
And not up to the minute in terms of the technology. Now, you said to me, you had a lovely phrase my mum used to use of the post office and Fujitsu. Post office as a client, champagne tastes on beer money.
Yes.
Was there budget which would have meant that Fujitsu wouldn't perhaps have built in all the safeguards that you would have on one of the mission critical type projects you described?
Yeah, I mean, that is the case. So you get to start building it, which is where you spend the lion's share of your money. Okay, you've got a pool of money, you've got your requirements, you've done your design, you've got all your documentation, thousands and thousands of pages of it. You then get the developers to develop it. Now, what happens is you're running out of time. You say it's going to take 18 months. You get into doing the coding and you're 14 months in and you're not finished on the coding yet and you've still got to test it. Well, what happens is the money is running out, the coders aren't quite finished, the testers are starting to get a bit itchy, post office is starting to get a bit itchy, and then you've got 2.5 months left. And bearing in mind, you've got to train up the postmasters, you've got to do a whole load of things on post office, they've got to sign it all off.
Yeah.
So the testing gets squeezed. You're running out of money, you're running out of time, and you need to hit the deadline or else, because there's contractual penalties, I think, if I remember right. And so the testing is the one thing that tends to fall by the wayside. So not only have you lumped in a whole load of risk, okay, you're then asking a bunch of people who are doing the testing to test it quickly. Something is going to get missed.
You had a very vivid image you gave me. You talked about fixing the faults in Horizon. You said it was like trying to mend the wings of a plane when it was in flight.
Absolutely.
Robin, was there an element of sticking plasters being applied by Fujitsu to make the plane fly when it may not have been really ready?
Well, yeah, there's one example. There was some of the guys I was working with, they got called in to look at an issue. And this was Christmas.
Yeah.
So Christmas is a very busy trading period for everybody. Post office is no exception. And it was almost like a perfect storm from how I remember it. These guys were like having to look at an issue that was looming. I think that year, pension day fell on Christmas Eve.
Yeah, so very busy.
They just put a whole new load of software in, okay, which had been rushed through because of the reasons I explained to you. And this software wasn't meeting its contractual performance, and it wouldn't meet the peak performance that tends to happen over Christmas. Everybody was getting very nervous that the actual system was going to fall over. They were trying almost war game situations. If we did this, would this happen? Nobody really had confidence. It's like throwing a snowball off a hill. It's gathering size and speed and pace, and if you get in the way, it's going to knock you over. But it was a snowball.
Just so Planet Normal listeners can see what's going on, huge pressure on the Horizon system, which was never intended to be a full accounting system, was it?
No, it was never intended to be a branch trading system. So selling things from fishing licenses through to travel insurance to doing bureau de change. It was never intended to be that. It was actually intended to be a welfare payment system. And you would replace the paper pension books and the benefit books, and you get a card. And it was designed to distribute those funds. So
we've got this software that was not designed for the purpose of thousands of postmasters using it, doing millions of transactions. You've got a peak busy period like Christmas. Yep. And one option you said to me was to relieve the pressure on the system, you could switch off the no data loss policy.
Yeah.
If they switched off the no data loss policy, although that would make the system work faster, that would be risky because basically you would be losing a trail of the transactions, wouldn't you?
Yeah, if you consider the fact that the terminals, the counters themselves were prone to maybe a blue screen, or the phone line might pack up, and then suddenly you've got it capturing the transactions in the actual central part of the system, and they'd switch the no data loss off there. That was something that I don't think they were reluctant to countenance, but it was an option being given to them to consider. And nobody could put their hand on their heart and say, it won't lose any data, it won't time out, because they were dealing with a performance issue where it wasn't working fast enough with a load of software in it that really hadn't been tested adequately, not for a mission-critical system.
I'm going to say to you now a phrase you said to me that almost made my heart stop. Every single conviction was unsafe.
Yes, they are. I mean, even under the old legacy horizon and even under the new one, as I watched the inquiry, you've got people basically not being able to guarantee that the system is safe. Okay, and you've got to the point where a High Court judge has ruled the system isn't safe. Okay, so it's irrelevant what the likes of the people at Fujitsu say. They've had countless audits. They've got a High Court judge ruling saying the system isn't safe, and that was Legacy Horizon. I left the account sometime where basically the replacement Horizon was put on hiatus. You mentioned champagne tastes beer money. There was this kind of, oh, hang on, this is a substantial undertaking, we need to have a rethink. I moved off the account around that time. Too much money to fix.
Let's leave it as on a wing and a prayer.
Yeah, pretty much. And it wasn't as if every time they put changes in that they didn't actually then create more defects. And then even when they did replace it, they created more defects.
Yeah.
And they created defects in areas where nobody that handles money would ever countenance a defect in terms of adding it up or handling it or moving it. There were defects there. I mean, banks come in for a lot of stick, but the one thing they don't get wrong, or they don't get wrong very often, shall we say, is they don't make mistakes when it comes to dealing with money. And their technology is geared for that. And if they do have an issue, they address it very quickly. They don't sit on it and pretend it didn't happen.
Robin, how would you describe the atmosphere and culture on the Horizon team at Fujitsu? You actually talked to me about a toxic atmosphere, and I was very struck by the fact that you used the word Chernobyl in terms of people. Was challenging the view that everything was fine difficult?
Yes, it was. It was, because once you've been working on something for so long, you accept it warts and all. Okay, and you know that there are things to look out for. There are things it does very well, and I think my overall impression, to summarise the feelings that I've carried with me for 20 years, was it was just absolute hubris.
Right.
You know, these guys were working to an arcane set of practices, working on arcane technology, and they were perfectly happy with that. Whereas, quite clearly, we heard from the counter team, you know, building a new version of the counter, the terminal, as you call it. They were telling us this thing's had its day already. They get countless support calls. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with the way it behaves. They don't get enough information about the performance of their business. And even they were kind of hamstrung because, you know, they were trying to build something new and having the same level of resistance from the people that ran the existing counter.
Hubris is a very interesting choice of word. Were there people where there would be denial of any problems? We know that Computer Weekly was starting to run articles about arrests and things going wrong in the post office. I suppose what I want to know is, why did no one at Fujitsu say, hang on a minute, we were hearing about all these arrests and convictions based on the accounts. Did no one say something going wrong with the system? Was there any potential admission that this was a problem with the software?
I can draw on one example. If you go back to the Christmas example, apparently they isolated the problem, and it was Fujitsu's fault. Okay, somebody somewhere had made a mistake. And I sort of raised my eyebrows and said, that's a pretty major mistake. And I said, well, what's going to be the consequence of that? Nothing. And then we'll write a report to Post Office, and whoever's going to go and have a conversation with them, and we won't say anything about what the actual problem was. We'll try and skirt around it. And that for me, when it comes to finding fault, this is a system where money is moving, and now we know the human cost of mistakes that were made. And there was this kind of blithe attitude that they weren't running a mission-critical system. And for me, there were pockets of people that understood the seriousness of what they were doing, but it was more a case of, we're not going to take any risks, and therefore we'll be fine. Well, that's not how you do it. You accept all the risks, and you make sure they don't happen. And it was really a case of they had their head in the sand, and it was very difficult to raise issues to leadership to say, I'm not happy about this. I found this in the existing system. Can someone please tell me what happens if this happens? It was very difficult.
So a culture of fear of management. Can we just turn to the prosecution of sub-postmasters? Up to 1,000 innocent men and women, some 240 of them ending up in jail, losing everything. You say the lawyers were on a budget, so many of the alleged fraud cases were not investigated with actual data. Robin, were sub-postmasters convicted when there was no accurate data of their transactions available?
They were convicted on the basis of faulty data.
Okay.
Because there is one thing with a mission critical system you have to have. Okay, first of all, it has to work, and it has to remain working, and it has to be there all the time. And you have to double up on everything that you have, triple up on everything that you have. But the one thing you have to have as well is if it does go wrong, you need to find out how it went wrong and where it went wrong, and you have to fix it very quickly. And then everything that it produces has to be produced to a degree of truth and fidelity as well, because you have to put your faith in this thing. Mission critical systems, they're called mission critical because basically people can die if you get it wrong.
Right.
The most extreme case, right? And in this example, very, very sadly, that is the case. So you have to have these things. And one of the things when it comes to the data in the system is you have to have this thing called a single source of truth.
Yeah.
And then when you look at how the auditing is done, in the last couple of days of the inquiry hearing, you've got technical people admitting that they're having to clean this data up. And yet that's meant to be your single source of truth there for people to look at in terms of what went wrong to fix it. More importantly, if there are bad people, and there are, okay, in that human nature says so, but to not have a single source of truth and to disturb its fidelity in that way means that no convictions are safe. Not even in the very small example of people that did actually commit fraud, because that is an actual fact of life, even their convictions aren't safe because they've tampered with this source of truth and they've allowed people to go in and tamper it and do that on behalf of someone else. There's no fidelity in it.
You say, with your very, very vast and distinguished experience in this field, impersonating sub-postmasters to change branch data is desperation stakes. I would never, ever tolerate going into private accounts. But senior management working on the original Horizon system must absolutely have known that was going on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's no way around it, because if you draft up a document like that and you say, we need to do it this way, and then you need to go and get funding to do it, that funding doesn't come out of thin air. That has to come from Post Office, or Fujitsu has funding it's willing to put in its own platform as well. There's also that dimension. But the people that hold that funding will not let it go unless they know the reason why. Because it's a finite resource. Money doesn't grow on trees, and that money could be earmarked for doing something else. So you're going to have that conversation. Now, the people that typically hold funds in that kind of business are accountable and responsible to the performance and success of the account. And no doubt they've got a superior that's also got a number of accounts. And then you're into almost like the regional management of Fujitsu Corporation. Okay, so you're working at the highest levels of the business here. They would have to know.
So when Paula Venables, former CEO of the Post Office, kept insisting publicly that Horizon was as secure as Fort Knox, was she, in your marvellous phrase, either an idiot or she was lied to? Which or both? What do you think?
Yeah, both. Honestly, CEOs can't be everywhere all the time, okay? And they delegate their authority to their board, and they have people in that role that I like to think have got to the top by merit, and they are the ones that discharge what the CEO wants to do. And the idea that she sends an email out to her staff to find out a question that she then says, I want the answer yes, is just beggars belief. I mean, that's just absolutely barking mad. And there's nothing stopping her, if it was such a critical issue, from getting out of her office and walking the floor. My career started in the late 1980s, okay? And I can give you the measure of any good CEO. From then to now, they walk the floor. They know their staff. They literally ignore their first line, go out and talk to the post boy, how you doing? And that is something that any good CEO is more than capable of doing, okay? She could have walked out of her office, got in her car, gone to Fujitsu and gone and had a conversation with the accountant and said, right, I want to know exactly what's going on. She's perfectly empowered to do that, okay? And if it was that serious an issue, then she should have absolutely done that, okay? You don't have to go through your management team.
Okay, I'm gonna put you on the spot now, because you talked to me about when you arrived and you were going around talking to different people, different areas, and you said that there was some reluctance, even secrecy, about telling you about certain elements of the original Horizon. Robin, do you think there was a conspiracy at Fujitsu to conceal faults which ultimately led to this historic miscarriage of justice?
I mean, if I think back to my first few weeks, maybe first few months there, I think once the honeymoon period wore off, which was pretty quickly, I do remember a conversation in passing, and I was kind of on the periphery of where they came back and said, oh, we've just had the independent fraud review. I don't know which one it was. I wish I did. And they said, 96% of all fraud is committed by postmasters. And having gone around the houses and talking to people, because I had this roaming brief to find out about how Legacy Horizon worked, what struck me was 96%. First of all, who's the other 4%? And more worryingly, how can they be so sure? Okay. And I sort of asked, my boss at the time, I said, that's an impressive number. And he said, yeah. And I said, well, to be honest with you, we haven't quite started that area yet. I think maybe we should make a start while people have got it fresh in them. And so we did start to make some inquiries about, okay, well, how do we safeguard the post office's money? How do we, it was very much from the post office perspective, much to my kind of eternal shame now, really. But I guess I had no idea what was going to happen. But we started looking around. And I think what struck me was when we started to talk to the security teams, and when it comes to securing vast sums of money. So one fact that I don't think's been shared is Post Office was Europe's largest retail system.
Wow. Okay.
But it was also the largest, you can't call them a bank, but they moved something like, I don't know, it was almost like a 20% of the country's gross national product in welfare and benefits and pension payments. I mean, they were moving hundreds of billions of pounds.
Let's just pause now. Let's just allow this terrible thought to sink in. This system, which was inadequate, which had not been designed for those purposes, was processing hundreds of billions of pounds of public money in a system which could fall down at busy times. That's correct. That's correct, isn't it?
That's a reasonable comment. Reasonable comment.
I'm not making a reasonable comment. I'm shouting, Robin. It's bloody awful. Are there people you worked with who should be in jail?
Gosh, I think you touched upon the conspiracy question earlier. And I do think that is the case, that they knew that this system had its shortcomings and they chose to stay quiet. Now, as far as I'm concerned, in light of what's happened, and Computer Weekly was a Bible in those days. We read the first reports from Computer Weekly. And
this is the reports about the sub-postmasters.
These were the first reports and the first kind of clues, and Private Eye as well. And it was raising questions, and it was a somewhat muted response, and it was almost like a case of, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? And my view is I do think that there is a group of people in Fujitsu on that account that have been there a long time, that know about this stuff. I do not believe for 1 second that nobody in the third line support did not share what they were doing, because they were fixing problems with the system. Those problems have a trail.
Right. So basically, the people who were dipping in and out of the allegedly, supposedly private postmasters accounts, there is no way their senior managers would not have known what they were doing.
There is no way, because they're fixing issues and they are logged and they are discussed and they go onto defect queues and they have this known error log, this thing called the CAL. There's no way on earth that nobody, because you see what happens is to fix it costs money, and the people that hold money are senior people, and they would then have to ask the question, why do you want all this money to fix this thing for? You can't then just look them in the eye and say, oh, you don't need to know, because these people have the power to hire and fire staff. It just does not fit with the corporate world. Okay, that is not how the corporate world works.
We have this week seen Paul Patterson, Fujitsu's Europe director.
Yes.
He told the inquiry on Tuesday that we did have bugs and errors in the system, and we did help the post office in their prosecution of the sub-postmasters, and for that we are truly sorry. Some people might say that sorry is a very small word.
Too little, too late.
Too little, too late. Yes, indeed. And as you said to me, guilty until proven innocent was the modus operandi here. Robin, I know you've thought about these matters very deeply. You told me when you agreed to do this interview, I want to be able to look my partner and kids in the eye and say I did my bit. What do you think? You have effectively told Planet Normal that you do believe there was a conspiracy at the highest levels in Fujitsu to suppress the news that the Horizon system was deeply flawed and probably indeed leading in many cases to those errors for which postmasters were jailed. What do you think should happen now in terms of prosecutions and compensation by Fujitsu? And let us not forget the grotesque mismanagement within the post office.
I mean, the first thing is, first of all, with convictions being quashed, then the actual accusation of fraud, the shoe goes onto a different foot, because the post office has taken postmasters' money fraudulently, okay? Because it immediately give it back. That should be incontrovertible. You've taken that money with false prosecution, give the money back. That's the first thing. Second thing is, I do believe that, I think one of the things I like to think is that this is a serious fraud or a serious crime. You therefore send the appropriate delegation of senior police people to go and take a look. And I've heard there's been issues with disclosure. Well, in the old days, in the days when something like the Department of Trade and Industry actually had teeth, they'd go in and raid an office and walk out with boxes and boxes of files.
So they should be raiding Fujitsu's offices in Bracknell, and you said to me there are two major databases, one in Bootle and one in Hertfordshire. Is that correct?
Yeah, they do keep their records, and I do think that there should be court orders now to look at this in terms of a criminal investigation. I mean, I'm reading that is the next stage. Well, I'm sorry, this has gone on for 25 years. I do think there's been a conspiracy to suppress the truth on both sides of the equation. I think Fujitsu's lied to Post Office. I think Post Office has lied to Fujitsu. Nobody comes out of this very well. It's like it's a very abusive relationship. And I do think that you bring, for a matter like this of such seriousness and such a miscarriage of justice, you bring the full weight of the law to bear on these people. And there's a very, very simple reason for that, is that if you're going to be accountable for running something so important, there are consequences when you don't do it right. And people have died. Mission critical systems are that because there's a risk to life, or there's a risk to substantial financial loss. And in this example, that is exactly what's happened. You have to have that sanction. You just can't get away with it. Constant stories, really, of people failing upwards. It's clearly happened in Post Office, to the point where they're now saying they're sorry 25 years later. For me, you have to have that. It's effective corporate governance in that if you are responsible, you take that kind of money, you have to be held accountable. And what we've seen here is, didn't happen on my watch, therefore it's nothing to do with me. That's not good enough.
Robin, not your real name, not your real voice. Have to say, it has been an absolute privilege to talk to you. This is,
likewise,
we know, such a heartbreaking major story. We're incredibly grateful, the whole team on Planet Normal, for your help in beginning to explain so we can understand what really happened. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Allison.
Now, in April, Planet Normal listeners were joined by former Home Secretary Suella Braverman, who told us about the barriers she faced when trying to tackle the surge in UK immigration and her frustration with then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Over recent weeks, Braverman, who remains the MP for Fareham and Waterlooville, has withdrawn from the race to become the next Tory leader, although she remains a popular figure with many grassroots Conservative Party members. Allison started by asking Suella Braverman about the now defunct Rwanda scheme, and if there ever was a chance it could have been up and running by July.
Well, Alison, I have a lot of misgivings about the new legislation, and that's why I voiced those concerns back in November following the defeat in the Supreme Court, and then I voted against it at third reading in the House of Commons at the beginning of the year. I couldn't, in good conscience, support yet another doomed piece of legislation that is destined to fail. And I'm afraid I don't agree with the Prime Minister on this. I don't agree that this new Act of Parliament, our third Act of Parliament, will stop the boats. And that's the test. It may well be the case that we get a flight or two or even a few flights off with a low number of passengers on them to Rwanda. I think that is possible. But in order to actually deliver a deterrent effect that stops the people smuggling gangs, that stops people crossing the channel in the first place, we need regular flights, more than once a week, for example, with hundreds of passengers on those flights going to Rwanda at a large scale. That's the only way you effect a deterrent. And so I don't think we will be able to achieve that on this piece of legislation. And the fatal flaw with this new Act of Parliament is that it doesn't sufficiently exclude all of the legal claims to which you're referring. So people will still be able to bring individual claims asserting that to send them to Rwanda would be a violation of their human rights. It would harm their health. It would break up their family relations. It would expose them to some tenuous risk of torture. And all of these claims will clog up the courts. The second big problem is that this bill, this new Act of Parliament, still allows for the Strasbourg Court to intervene. It does not, in terms, state that the Strasbourg Court cannot issue an injunction, or it does not state, something that I would have preferred to have seen, that these injunctions issued by the Strasbourg Court, these so-called pajama injunctions, we saw it in June a few years ago when the plane was on the tarmac, and at the last minute, the court in Strasbourg, an unnamed judge, no reasons were given. The UK government didn't even have a chance to make representations in that process, handed down an injunction that blocked the flight from taking off. There's nothing in this Act of Parliament that stops that from happening again. So I fear a rerun of what we saw a few years ago on the tarmac.
So Lord Cameron said today it's not necessary to leave the ECHR, European Convention on Human Rights, to stop the small boats. Do you disagree with him?
I do. I've been calling for some years now that it's necessary to leave the ECHR, and I think the case is the most compelling that it's ever been. Following what happened in June 2022 on the tarmac, we saw the interventionist, politicised court stop this government from controlling its borders. But we've seen many more unacceptable extensions of the court's power into our policy making. And in a whole host of policy areas, it's not just in immigration and asylum. We see the European Convention on Human Rights, as applied by the Strasbourg Court of Human Rights, undermining parliamentary supremacy, sovereignty, and the British people's will, as expressed at elections, to control their borders. So I do think the time has come to leave. I think we need to do it now. We've got a mandate. We've got a majority. We may not do so for a long time. We must use that opportunity, and this window of time is closing rapidly.
Suella, the PM also claimed that the backlog of asylum claims had been cleared. Now, what did he mean by that? How many have been cleared, and where are those people now? This is a borders emergency. This is a public safety emergency. But overall, this is a national security emergency. We've had tens of thousands of people come into our country illegally. Many of these people are at large in our communities, and they're not in detention. They're not in incarceration. They are at large. And unfortunately, not all, but many of them do go on to criminal behavior involved in drugs supply and drugs dealing, violent crime. There is a real public safety issue, and there's a national security risk here. So this is an emergency, and I don't think there's any time to lose. We need to act now while we still can to actually, as I say, use our majority, use our mandate, and do what is necessary to stop the boats. There are backlogs and there are backlogs, if I can put it that way. There's the overall backlog of all the cases coming into our asylum system, even those being lodged today. And you'll never get that down to zero, because on any day, there will be some people coming into the system. So you're always going to have a flow of cases coming in, and they do take some time to process. We also have what we call the legacy backlog, which is historic cases dating
up to about the end of 2022. Now that last year, that amounted to about 100,000 cases. Now, some of those cases had been in the system for several years, 2, 3, 4 years in some instances, and there'd been very slow processing of these cases. Now, the important point to remember is that when an asylum seeker is in our Home Office system, they are being accommodated at the expense of the British taxpayer. So it's costing us £6 million a day to accommodate people. We've run out of actual bespoke asylum accommodation, so we've had to use hotels. And many, many hotels around towns and cities in the UK are being taken up by asylum seekers commissioned by the Home Office. We did succeed. When I was Home Secretary, I was really frustrated with this, and we did actually start to turn the tide on hotel use, and we started to close some of those hotels and start to use other forms of accommodation. To be honest, it's a symptom of a broader problem, but it was one thing that we did manage to do logistically. But the case remains that there are still too many people in the system waiting for a decision. The asylum legacy backlog has largely been cleared through faster processing, more streamlined systems, more caseworkers, and trying to get through the cases more quickly. A large proportion of that 100,000 cases constituted people from countries like Iran or Afghanistan. And so they would have largely been granted asylum. They will then be taken off the Home Office books and be allowed to stay in the UK legally. So that's what's been happening.
But what I'm concerned about, I don't have to tell you this, official government figures show that of the 129,407 initial asylum decisions received between April 2023 and April 2024, 89,365 were substantive decisions, 56,744 granted, and 36,597 refusals. That is a grant rate of 61%. Suella, why is our grant rate so much higher than, say, France's? And is it safe to process so many thousands of asylum claims that quickly with presumably inadequate checks on mainly young men who have no documentation?
Again, I'm afraid this comes back down to our human rights laws. So what will happen is people will say, an asylum seeker will typically say, well, I've got a human right or I've got a refugee convention right to stay in the UK. And they will typically base their claims on things like, well, I've got a family member in the UK. So that's Article 8. And if you deport me or if you refuse me asylum, I'm gonna fight it in court. And generally speaking, because we're subject to these human rights laws, the government will lose. Or they'll say, as we saw tragically earlier this year, I used to be a Muslim, but now I'm a Christian. And here's my certificate of baptism from my local vicar who signed me off as a God-fearing, church-going Christian. And I'm Christian, and if you send me back to my Muslim country of origin, I'm going to get persecuted.
Yes, I get all the reasons that people use to wangle to stay. I'm asking you, why is our grant rate 3 times the grant rate of France?
It's because people will largely use these grounds to seek asylum. And because we are hamstrung by European Convention rules and human rights laws, we have to grant them asylum effectively. If someone comes along and says, I'm a Christian, you've got to let me stay, it's almost impossible right now to challenge that and say, no, we're going to refuse you asylum. That's what happens. And it's because of the human rights laws. It's because of the case law that's been borne out of these courts and the laws that we're subject to. We haven't changed them sufficiently, that the decision makers in the Home Office just know that if they refuse, it will get appealed, and then the judge will allow it. So that's how the system works. And I say this.
So just to clarify, France must surely be subject to the same legislation as us.
Well, they take actually a more restrictive view of some of these matters. We've got a particular combination of the European Convention on Human Rights, the Refugee Convention as well, the Human Rights Act. That's something the French don't have. So we've incorporated these laws into British laws. And we've got the added factor of a very expansive judicial review regime and, frankly, quite activist judges and very well-coordinated NGOs and lawyers. I used to raise this issue with my opposite number, the French Interior Minister, Gérald Darmanin, quite a lot. I used to say, listen, don't you have similar problems with, vexatious claims and unmerited claims based on human rights? He would say no, he didn't really recognize that. And I think that's because the French courts have a very different legal system. They have a much more restrictive system when it comes to giving out welfare to asylum seekers, giving out accommodation to asylum seekers, and granting asylum in the first place based on grounds like religion or family life rights. So they do have a very different legal ecosystem compared to the one we have in the UK. I think we have the worst of both worlds. We are subject to the European Convention, but we've also added to it through our own domestic laws and our judicial review frameworks.
When you wrote your resignation letter, very spirited resignation letter to the Prime Minister last November, you recalled, Suella, how you said you would serve as Rishi Sunak's Home Secretary if he agreed to a number of conditions. Now, they included reducing legal immigration by increasing salary thresholds on work visas, reforming international students' routes, and so on. Legal immigration last year was 745,000, a deafening number, quite frankly, and one which will make a lot of former Conservatives not vote Conservative. Do you personally feel let down or betrayed by those guarantees that Rishi Sunak gave you?
I agreed to support the Prime Minister on the condition that he agreed to make those changes to legal migration. I was incredibly concerned about the spiraling levels of net migration. I voted to leave the European Union in 2016 and campaigned for Brexit because I wanted to lower overall numbers. The 2019 manifesto made a pledge to lower overall numbers. And yet, 3 or 4 years into this parliament, we were moving in precisely the opposite direction. So I was very frustrated in 2022 about what had gone on previously. And it was a condition of my support for the Prime Minister. As time went on, it became apparent that he wasn't really interested in this subject. It took me about a year to even get a face-to-face meeting with him on proposals. I was left to sending several letters to him with the proposals in them. And in the end, he, under duress, I would say, did ultimately announce some measures at the end of last year, but only after unprecedented levels of net migration. I was able to speak more freely outside government and say what a disgrace the situation had become in a way that I would never have been able to do had I been around the cabinet table. And ultimately, I was met with a lot of resistance from the economic departments, from the education department, from the health department. There's an institutional view in Whitehall that more migration is better for the economy. It's better for universities. It's better for the NHS. It's better for our country, full stop. There's no acknowledgement whatsoever within the Treasury or within government about the costs of migration, about the impacts on our resources like schools and housing, or on the impacts on social and cultural cohesion. And I think that's why the British people have voted time and time again to lower migration. And it has been a failure of government to deliver on that promise so far.
Well, I'm very interested to hear that the Prime Minister wasn't particularly interested in immigration when it comes out as the top concern of Conservative voters. Now, another reason you left government was over what you call the two-tier policing of the pro-Palestine marches in London. You wrote in your letter to Rishi Sunak, "I have become hoarse, urging you to consider legislation to ban the hate marches and help stem the rising tide of racism and intimidation and terrorist glorification now threatening community cohesion." So this week there's been a major row, I know you'll have seen that, about the policing of the marches, with one police officer accusing Gideon Falter of the campaign against anti-Semitism of being openly Jewish and therefore a provocation to the marchers. What's your take on that form of words and on the way this thing you warned about is unfolding?
It's wholly unacceptable. We've now seen 6 months of these approximately weekly marches and hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets, glorifying terrorism, chanting jihad, celebrating anti-Semitism, being intimidating, abusive and threatening, scaling war memorials, firing flares, waving flags with anti-Semitic tropes. And we've seen the police turn a blind eye. And it's a totally unacceptable example of double standards. And I saw that in November, and I see it now in April, glaringly. And the incident last weekend shone a light on this double standard, this unacceptable two-tier policing, whereby the police are totally abandoning their duty to police without fear or favour. There's far too much fear, and I'm afraid there's even more favouritism when it comes to policing these marches.
Should Sir Mark Rowley, the Metropolitan Commissioner, resign?
I have regrettably come to the sad conclusion that yes, he must, because we've seen this go on for such a protracted period of time. There's been meetings, there's been the Prime Minister speaking on the steps of Downing Street. They've announced a new law, they've been talking about it, and yet it still keeps getting worse. And why I believe we need a change of leadership is because there have been big errors. There's been an error of strategy. The police have adopted the approach to these marches that they adopt when they are policing football fans and football crowds, whereby in that scenario, they choose one group and they say, look, we're going to allow the larger group to dominate and we're going to form a cordon around them, and any other smaller group or individual who comes along, we're just going to wave them out of the way. You can't apply that approach to what we're seeing play out with these marches, because these marches are about a very complex and sensitive and emotive issue relating to politics in the Middle East. They're about race, religion, and identity. People are dying out in the Middle East, and people feel very strongly on both sides of the debate. And you can't treat them like one team or another. You can't treat them like Man United or Chelsea fans. This is wholly different. And so they've taken the wrong approach strategically. They've chosen a side. And how do you think that makes Jewish people feel around the country? I don't think they've considered how this makes Jewish people feel, an ethnic minority in our country. And if this policeman had spoken to anybody else of a different ethnicity, a Black person, an Asian person, a Muslim person, in the way that he spoke to that Jewish man last week, there would be universal outrage. And I'm sure Samart would no longer be in his post anymore. But because it's directed towards Jews, it's somehow more acceptable. And institutionally, and there's a collective turning of a blind eye to this flagrant racism and anti-Semitism. That's wholly unacceptable. And that's why I felt so angry and heartbroken by that injustice that I saw. And the injustice I've seen play out on our streets month after month, that I have come to that conclusion to speak out about what must now happen.
Finally, you are the daughter of proud Asian immigrants. You grew up in a corner of northwest London, not too far from co-pilot Halligan, as he constantly reminds me. I think you went to the same primary school, not at exactly the same time, but clearly it produces some marvellous, resolute individuals. Suella, why do you feel so strongly as the child of immigrants about controlling immigration?
Oh, that's a great question. And you're right. Yes, Liam and I share a primary school and from a similar part of London. And that part of London, Wembley in Brent, has traditionally been an area of deprivation, actually. It's very multi-ethnic, multi-faith, more so now than it was even when I was growing up. I feel so passionate about controlling migration because I believe it's the basic duty of a country to be able to control who is coming in to the country and to know who is in the country for public safety reasons and national security reasons. I think it's also, and this is why I was so compelled to take the difficult decision back in 2016 to vote to leave the European Union. I was a new MP. I'd only been in Parliament for a year when I had to have the conversation with David Cameron and say, my heart is telling me to vote for Brexit. I did that because I think that we need, it's not sustainable It's not sustainable for our country with limited resources to accommodate millions and millions of people every year. The forecast is from the ONS that in the next 8 to 10 years, we're set to receive over 6 million more net pull into the British population. That is going to require many, many more doctors and nurses, many, many more school places, many more homes. We struggle to provide sufficient resources for the population as it stands today. So how on earth can we build 5 more Birminghams around the country in the next 10 years? That is not realistic. And therefore, from an allocation of resources point of view, it is essential that we get a grip on migration now. It's also important because of cultural cohesion and social cohesion. The pace of immigration has been far too quick in recent years, and people are coming to our country who don't necessarily share our values because they don't want to participate in British life or take part in British integration. They are living parallel lives and contributing to a fraying of the social fabric. That's very dangerous for a country. We all need to be united behind an inspiring and common vision. In order to do that, we all need to identify what that vision looks like, and we all need to sometimes make some sacrifices. But if you've got areas of our country where certain communities are demanding that Sharia law be imposed on communities, or demanding that blasphemy laws be respected, we can't criticize Islam. Or if we've got people coming into the country and they're not speaking English as a basic requirement, they're not going to be able to take part fully in British society. And I think that is very worrying for the future of our country.
Suella, thank you for joining us. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for joining us for this latest edition of Planet Normal. We'll have another selection of best of interviews from the last year next week. And Allison and I will be back with the very latest news and views from beyond the bubble on Thursday, the 22nd of August. In the meantime, stay in touch with us and with each other. Keep the emails rolling in to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk.
Please leave us a rating and a review on Spotify, which the co-pilot and I, in the dark reaches, the sad, long, dark reaches of the night, read to cheer ourselves up.
And on that bombshell, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.